Yes, let's get started.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. All right, so let's start. So CFA is basically dedicated to preserving the filmic heritage of the Midwest. Just a few notes about CFA before we get started. Chicago Film Archives is a regional nonprofit established in late 2003 by Nancy Watros, who's also our executive director. And it was initially founded to help preserve and catalog over 5,000 16mm films that were donated by the Chicago Public Library because they were in danger of being thrown out completely while they were making the transition from, having basically an analog collection and switching out to VHS and DVDs. So the idea was to preserve those films since many of them were unique prints. A note about our mission statement and the kinds of collections that we have. CFA is dedicated to identifying, collecting, preserving, and providing access to films that represent the Midwest. At this point, our collections have grown tremendously, and we have over 40,000 films in our collections, and many of them feature unique and singular material. There's newsreels, there are documentary films, industrial works, experimental work, educational films, animation, lots of home movies, you name it. So we have a short trailer about not just the kind of archives that we have at CFA, but also the importance of what we do. So I'll screen this trailer in a second.
It's beautiful. I think it's very nice indeed.
We feel that it is extremely important to bring a message to people throughout the country.
It's just our way of living, our way of life. The people in the streets are me.
It's like all those other male filmmakers, saying, oh, well, here's this woman, I might as well film her.
If you're white, you're right. If you're black, stay back.
Okay. So my role at CFA is basically, again, the collections manager. And being a collections manager at a film archive, a lot of the responsibilities, of course, are the same for regardless of the kind of collection that you have, whether you're in charge of a paper archive or rare book collection and things like that. But obviously, a lot of it comes down to the kind of object care you're responsible for. But essentially, the role of a collections manager in a film archive boils down to, you're responsible for the intake and management of all new acquisitions and the legalities surrounding that. There's a lot of back and forth about copyrights and different joint tenancy legal agreements or what have you that happens before we actually bring in a collection. The other major responsibility is overseeing the processing and researching of all the collections to gain knowledge of their content and legacies. We'll break down a bit what processing means, but essentially a lot of it has to do with stabilizing the film, making sure it gets digitized, and then creating a lot of work records and in-depth cataloging records for accessibility. So a lot of research goes into that. There's the exhibition and curatorial part of the work that needs to happen, whether it's film programming or how you exhibit it at your own space, whether if you have, your own film venue, or you're at a library, obviously you're displaying a lot of things in a specific way. That kind of falls under the purview of a collections manager. You're also managing a lot of databases and overseeing environmental controls, which is a big one when it comes to film for sure. And also managing conservation projects, which we'll talk about towards the end. So processing collections, what we mean by that when it comes to film is essentially you're trying to establish a baseline of organization, and then from that you branch out into stabilizing, inspecting, taking care of each individual film reel, and so on. So the first step is creating an inventory, just inventorying every single item and putting it into a database. And then the next step is basically inspecting and cleaning, and then making a lot of light repairs to the films and rewinding them properly, because sometimes you get a lot of films that haven't been rewound properly. And then you rehouse them in archival containers. Now, this step takes a lot of an archive's capacity. So the baseline is always you have to have an inventory of your collection. But then the actual inspection and film cleaning and stuff could come later, depending upon an archive's resources. So for example, this is a snapshot of films in our vault, and they kind of show you what processed films in our collections look like and what unprocessed films look like. So anything in gray and blue archival cans have been completely processed. So they've gone through the process of not just being inventoried, but they've also been inspected, cleaned, lots of light repairs. They've been rehoused, obviously, and many of them have already been digitized. If they haven't been, only the inventory has been created, which is what these labels on these tins mean, and they haven't been rehoused. So you can tell we have a lot of stuff that's been processed, but also tons of things that have just been inventoried and set aside until we have the capacity to kind of reach into those and also take the time to repair all of these films. And then the next step in terms of processing collections is basically you're transferring the films to digital using the film scanners, which we do in our office, and creating master files, as well as access digital copies for our website, which means basically access copies have, our logo and watermark and things like that. And they're primarily for researchers or anyone else going on our website to kind of research different elements of the collections that we have. So because inventorying is actually so essential, it's the kind of main rubric that you start out with when you're dealing with a film archive. I decided to spend a little bit of time here on best practices when it comes to inventorying film collections. So basically, after accession, you inventory the films to help you organize your collection. There's the difference between inventorying and film inspection is basically you're not doing an in-depth film inspection on the bench at this point, but you're collating a set of data points to help you better understand, one, the content, and two, also get a general idea of the collection's overall condition. So while you're going through the films, you're kind of making note of the film title, the kind of any container notes that it might have. You make note of that as well in your database, but you also kind of say, oh, this film looks very warped. Anything that kind of stands out immediately to you in terms of its condition, you make a note of it. Or it has severe Vinegar Syndrome, which we'll talk about in a sec. These are all important indications of the kind of overall condition of the collection and things that you should be aware of while you're trying to get a sense of how to organize it moving forward. In terms of naming each individual piece, what I recommend and many different film archives recommend is basically, it varies according to the database that each institution uses, of course. But the easiest thing for me is always, and for many film archivists, is to have the first part like a prefix of indicating the name of the collection, and then a minimum of a 3-digit configuration. So for example, if you received a collection from Jordan Robinson, you would have each individual piece in the film collection inventoried. The first one would be Robinson 001. Or if you have, for example, in our collection, we have several collections named Grisham. The last name, the family name being Grisham. So you would put D Grisham to kind of differentiate between that collection and another one that you may have already had. And then you also put down 503, indicating that this is item 503 that's being inventoried. The reason why we would prefer to go by collection name is because it's helpful for the inventory numbers to reflect the provenance of the collection in some way. And this gets especially important when you're dealing with different elements, like outtakes, negatives. Sometimes we have a collection that's from a big, documentary filmmaker, and they're not just giving us the main prints that were distributed at the time and screened, they're also giving us all of the elements, all of the trims, all of the audio tracks. It can get pretty difficult to kind of organize things if you're only relying in your collection on a sequential kind of numbering system, where it's just basically like if it belongs to a university and you're just naming it a bit generally, or numbering it 001 or 02 or things like that. It can get very confusing, especially with film where it has so many different kind of components and you want to try to keep it organized. And also, obviously having a sense of the provenance will also help you be able to get more detailed cataloging notes later on. So that's always the recommendation. And then, the inventory number is actually what's the number that we assign in the very initial stages before a collection has been processed. Once a collection has been processed, meaning it's been, fully inspected, it's been rehoused, and then digitized in lots of cases, we changed that to a control number that's a bit more involved. And just to give you an example of how our database functions, of course, is different for different kinds of databases. But for us, it would start out with F, which would be short for film, 2011-01, which is basically the collection ID, meaning that the film was received and accessioned in 2011, and it was the first item, the first collection, and that was received that year. And then, for example, it's the 1786 in that we received in that part of that collection. Or sometimes there's A, which starts for audio. And this is really, sometimes we'll get a lot of collections that will be open reel tapes or things like that. And so the prefix would be A for audio, and then you would use the same number. The rest of the control number would essentially be the same. That's just an example, but we usually try it in lots of film archives. We need to make the differentiation between when something has been inventoried and then later when it has been fully processed, so that we also know at a glance, oh, this collection is completely, all the work, the archival work for it has been done. It's managed properly. The digital iterations of it have been managed properly in our databases and all of that. But otherwise, you would kind of know that, oh, it's just been inventoried, but more work needs to be completed. So these are recommendations for sure on our end. And then just a few more notes. For sure, you will need lots of archival paper tape. Either way, when you're dealing with any film collection, one of the things that you will order first is a bunch of paper tape. And that's because we would label each item with paper tape, especially, so, sorry, there's some ambient noise where I am, but hopefully you can still hear me. There are, for example, this is a collection that we have for Tom Palazzolo, who was a documentary filmmaker who donated a lot of his work to CFA. These are each of the individual film reels that he gave us. Now, he's very funny. He gives us like his films and colanders or pizza boxes and things like that. And so then we have to go through that and organize everything. And we keep each roll separately at this stage. We, again, name it Palazzolo 994, Palazzolo 995. In this case, Palazzolo was condensed a bit. It wasn't condensed in the inventory record in our database, but physically it was, just because this collection has over 3,000 items and it's only 2 people inventorying it. That's absolutely fine for you to just label it like that. We still know what it is. You can, each archive is different and you can kind of follow different guidelines depending upon your own capacity. But anyway, these were all part of something that we found in one box. And so you wouldn't just put the label on the outside reel or tin, you would label each individual item. So it would be Palazzolo 994, Palazzolo 995, Palazzolo 996. These are all in one big box that you would label on the outside as well if you need to keep the box for different historical reasons, or it has a lot of container notes that's important to you in terms of cataloging later on. And you want to keep it for the moment. You would put down on the outside of the box Palazzolo 994 through 997 or what have you. But you open it and each item individually, it would look like this. Also, another point is when you're inventorying, you also need to mention the footage, like a rough kind of estimate of how long you think the film is, whether or not it seems to have sound, because these are 2 things that will always affect the cost of digitizing them later on and things like that. So if you're able to kind of go through the films quickly and get a sense of what they are as objects, then that will help you better determine a budget for stabilizing them later on. So let's take a step back and kind of get a general sense of what is film and its physical properties. So basically film is also referred to as celluloid because it's a strip of transparent film with plastic coating. Of course, these were first used for photography, but then it became, the film stock was further developed and became the main method for shooting and distribution of motion pictures. So movies are essentially, quite literally, pictures that move in sequential order. So a reel of celluloid film would capture images and strung together would simulate the illusion of movement. So chemically speaking, a flexible plastic strip is divided into frames, and each frame has a set of perforations on each side, or sometimes in one side, depending on the kind of film that you're dealing with, so that it could be fed through a camera or projector. Early cinema, the majority of it was shot on nitrate film. That was the chemical base for a lot of early film. And of course, that is kind of notorious for having the reputation for being extremely flammable, and it has to be handled with care. And later on, the switch was made to safety film in the 1950s because so many fires had happened at major film studios or what have you, or private collectors, that they were like, this isn't sustainable, it's not safe, let's switch to safety film. Safety film mostly means acetate, which is the main kind of chemical component that was used up until the late 70s, early 80s when polyester was introduced. But most film archives, for the most part, you will be dealing with either nitrates or acetate. And we'll get down to the different ways those 2 kinds of categories of film can deteriorate. Quick note, a theatrical format is usually 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, or 70 millimeter. 70 millimeter is super rare because it was so much more expensive for studios or filmmakers to produce. So only a handful of films historically have actually been shot on 70 millimeter, but it's still used, and it's still used until now by some filmmakers. 16 millimeter, because it tends to be cheaper, is usually what a lot of documentary film is shot on. 35 millimeter is really kind of like the gold standard for a lot of major 35 millimeter, for a lot of major, film productions that you would be kind of familiar with. What we would refer to as amateur or formats that were used for home use would be Super 8 millimeter and 8 millimeter. And these were kind of like, the contemporary equivalent of that would be sort of almost shooting film or video on your phone, because they were kind of meant to be like toys. So they're not the best, and they don't always survive as well, to be honest. They're not the most stable formats, but we have a ton of home movies and stuff that were shot on Super 8 and millimeter for sure. And then we also do have, more wealthier families, for example, we would shoot home movies on 16 millimeter. So those would also be amateur films. Some of the 16 millimeter would have an magnetic soundtrack, which we'll show you later, and that always tends to be the most likely to deteriorate faster due to all the scratches from constant projecting and all of that. But yes, this is just a general overview of the different film formats that will probably come your way when you're managing a film collection. So this is, during the inspection phase, once you've done all the inventorying work, you'll go into more in-depth work doing film inspection on a bench, and you'll be responsible for taking up a lot of metadata. So quick overview of different formats and what they look like. Basically, this is a 35 millimeter film. It's silent because we don't see any audio here. It would be on, the left-hand side. And then this is 16 millimeter, which has some audio, which you can see here. This is what 8 millimeter looks like. And then Super 8, which is an even thinner version of that format. So when we're inspecting a film on the bench, basically we're looking for first thing first is always the film stock, because the film stock kind of gives us an indication of when the film was made or shot or what have you, especially if you're dealing with camera negatives. In any case, so there's the main kinds of film stock available are Eastman Kodak, Orwo, which actually isn't used too often in America historically, but you will probably find a few. Agfa is another big one. The main difference you will find between Eastman Kodak and Orwo and Agfa is that the later two, Orwo and Agfa, don't always have detailed information on the film strip of the edge code and when it was produced. So on the film stock, you should be able to find, usually somewhere here printed, the company would print, different symbols indicating when the film was made and the kind of, the film stock. So if it's nitrate, it would usually say nitrate around here. Or if it's safety film, it would say safety film, usually Eastman Kodak safety film, so on. Some makers did not keep track of what they were producing, as well as Eastman Kodak. Eastman Kodak, or just Kodak film more generally, was more, they kept more in detailed records of the kinds of films that they were producing, and everything comes with funny looking symbols on the film strip and everything to kind of, for their own purposes, it was for copyright, intellectual property reasons. The other film stocks, which were used more for, either amateur filmmakers or things like that, they were cheaper. They didn't really care about their intellectual property being stolen. So that can be that can throw a wrench in your work on the bench while you're trying to kind of go through a film and get a better sense of when it was produced. But for the most part, especially when it comes to American film, almost everything was shot on Kodak, whether it was amateur or not. So usually you will be able to tell just by working on the bench when the film was made, or get a sense of it in some capacity. Of course, also while you're inspecting film, you're looking for the film gauge. So if it's Super 8, you put down Super 8. If it's 16 millimeter, you put that down. Another thing that we try to be on the lookout for is the base. So if the base of the film is nitrate, then you put that down. Or if it's acetate, you will also make a note of that. This is also another way in which the edge code of the film, if it exists, is helpful to you, because it will note clearly that this is safety film, or it will say this is nitrate on the strip, on the film strip itself. Other ways that you can tell is obviously by the way it's been deteriorating. So usually acetate film feels a little bit almost weaker. It's kind of gotten shrunk a little bit, most likely. I mean, if it's deteriorated pretty badly, it will smell like vinegar, which we'll get to in a bit what vinegar syndrome is. Nitrate basically smells like, a lot of people would say it smells like old socks. And it has like a weird musty smell. So you can kind of tell right away, but anyhow. In any case, you try to make an assessment of what kind of film base you're dealing with. And also the film elements, whether it's a negative, positive, a full magnetic track, which we'll get to later. Any of these things, if you're able to assess it without, on the bench, which you usually 90% of the time you will be able to do without having to digitize it or anything, you mark that down and enter it into your database. Also, we like to keep track of the number of splices a film has, because, if a film has been edited together or spliced together a lot, that means it will be far more time intensive, like to actually digitize. So I've come across short 60mm films that have over 400 splices because it's the original work print that the filmmaker was working with. This takes way longer for our digitization manager to digitize and produce a digital copy of for access. So that's always something to keep in mind in terms of your capacity as an organization, or when you're outsourcing this work to other organizations to do the digitization for you. That's something that they are always aware of, and it might add an extra charge depending. And then there's also shrinkage, which is basically how much the film has shrunk over time. For this, we recommend getting a shrinkage gauge if you can, if you have the capacity to do so or to borrow one. If not, then there are other ways to kind of measure, like kind of ballpark shrinkage to a certain extent. The extent of the film reel itself, which is how much in terms of footage it has. So if you have a small reel that's like 50 feet long, then you would make a note of that. We also mention whether or not the film has sound, whether it's color or black and white, and we make other condition notes, whether it has vinegar syndrome, if there's a lot of spoking or warpage, if there's mold that's very evident on the inspection bench, we need to keep track of that in our notes as well. So this is what sound would look like in different ways. So this is a strip of 60mm film, and this is optical sound. Optical sound, there are different kinds of optical sound. Basically, there would be like variable density tracks or whatever, but without getting super technical about it, it always looks like waves, and it would be on the right-hand side on this format, or the way the film is oriented now. But in any case, it's always on one side of the film. And then magnetic track would just look like this. It looks kind of like what a cassette tape, the inside of a cassette tape really, but on a bigger gauge. So this is full coat 16mm mag track. These usually, I would just tell archivists to be on the lookout for them all the time, because full coat mag, like a whole strip of just mag track, tends to be very unstable, and it is usually hit by vinegar syndrome super quickly. They hardly ever survive too well as film, because of their chemical composition and their physical composition. It tends to deteriorate very quickly. So that's something that you kind of want to keep an eye on if you have it in your collection. So these are a few examples of film deterioration. Of course, there are a lot more than this, but I just want to give you a general idea of what to be aware of in your own collections if you come across them. So this is one kind of, kind of a deterioration that you will find, and it will affect both nitrate or acetate film. It's basically where the film gets so dry, very, very brittle, it's shrunken completely, and it almost, it would be impossible to unfurl this. And it's kind of hit what some archivists also call brick syndrome. So it basically turned into a thing of brick, really, and you can't unwind it or anything. And at this point, it's super hard to kind of bring it back to life, unfortunately. But that's one form of deterioration that you will find. Another one is this, which is, this is acetate film, and it's very shrunken, and it's also bunching up a little bit. So the emulsion and the base, I mean, a strip of film is made up of a base, which is basically either acetate or nitrate or what have you, and then the emulsion, which is what the image is printed on it. And they're kind of breaking apart from each other. This is also called channeling. You can probably still digitize this in some way with using a very, gentle machine, but it will be costly, and there's really no way to get rid of this completely in the digital copy. It's also not great, but at least you can access it for historical purposes in one way or the other. This is a reel with Vinegar Syndrome. And basically you can see here that it's super shrunken, like it's kind of all coiled up. And then the inside looks very silvery. That usually means it's going to start emitting like a white powder as well. So the switch to safety film from nitrate resulted in a more stable film stock in terms of safety. And basically it wasn't being, set on fire, like it wasn't setting apartment buildings on fire anymore or anything like that, but it brought with it other problems, which is mostly vinegar syndrome. It's similar in some ways to nitrate deterioration, but instead vinegar syndrome obviously afflicts acetate, and it causes deep changes in the chemical nature of the plastic itself, and its progress or its survival depends largely on storage conditions. Vinegar syndrome, basically, it smells like vinegar. You will notice it as soon as it hits you if something in your collection has vinegar syndrome. It will smell like, some people say, a salad that has gone very, very wrong. That's basically it. It can get very intense depending on the level of deterioration. And also, honestly, its progress or its kind of survival as an object really ultimately depends on the kind of storage conditions you're able to afford. So when caring for films with vinegar syndrome, and I paid more attention to this because honestly, vinegar syndrome is something that afflicts most film collections because so much of film history has been shot on acetate film at this point. Vinegar syndrome is an even bigger problem, but I will make a note of how to store nitrate in vinegar in different ways in a sec. But in any case, the first thing you need to do with, if you find a reel that has severe vinegar syndrome in your collection, is basically to isolate it, because vinegar syndrome is very infectious. It can actually it migrates from from film to film and can infect other healthy films very quickly and cause them to also develop vinegar syndrome. So the first order of business is basically to isolate this reel. And then, it's recommended that you do an AD strip test. AD strips are little, basically color-coded strips that you can buy from the Image Permanence Institute. And you slip them into different film reels in your collection to kind of get a sense of where the acidity levels are. So if you already know that you had one film at some point that was exhibiting, even if it's just the early stages of vinegar syndrome and it's not completely, deteriorated or shrunken or warped yet, at least, it's still an indication that you need to do an AD strip test. And we recommend doing, slipping these strips into 20% of the collection to see where the acidity levels are, because based on that information, you'll end up having to reassess any modifications you need to do in terms of climate control. 20% of the collection is absolutely more than enough. You don't need to do the entire collection. Also, because AD strips are very expensive. So, you need to use them wisely. Basically, they kind of change colors after a few hours. You get all of the instructions from IPI, the Institute, on how to perform an AD strip, but they look blue, and then you put them into a container. And by the end of the testing period, maybe 2 days or a week, depending on the climate in your vault or what have you, you take it out and it's green or yellow, then that means the acidity levels in your collection are very high. in which case, especially if you have films that have severe vinegar syndrome, it's always prudent to consider investing in a cooling unit, refrigeration or freezing, depending on your institutional needs. And we make that distinction because sometimes a film, if it's a film that you need to access a lot for digitization purposes, research purposes, or stuff like that, refrigeration is probably best. But if you're okay with just digitizing it once and having that access copy be with you for however long the attendant technology lasts, I guess, that's fine. You can throw it in the freezer because a deeper cooling unit, because the thing is that you don't need to keep taking it out of the unit all the time. Bringing things back to room temperature after you've put it in a refrigeration or freezing unit can be a very time-consuming process. So anyway, it really depends on the different needs of the institution. There are a lot of other details about this, and I can help answer questions about that later, of course. But either way, check the Image Permanence Institute for further guidelines. And either way, you need to make sure that the temperature is around 20 degrees Celsius. Below that point, the humidity should never reach more than 50%. 50% is the absolute cutoff. Ideally, it would be less than that because humidity would cause condensation, and the condensation can damage the films more. So while you're doing this and you're doing the process of isolation and things like that for the vinegar films, you should always make note of the films that can and should be photochemically preserved, if possible, so that you can apply for a grant and produce a new copy of that or a new print, or digitized, at least for access purposes, before the deterioration becomes severe, because sometimes if you leave it for too long, it'll just be gone. And it'll be very, very difficult to kind of capture what was on the film without doing a lot of heavy-handed chemical treatments and stuff like that. And it's very costly. And most archives don't have the capacity to do that. They would send it to Color Lab, which is also the only place in the US at this point standing that can do that kind of work. So we'll talk about that in a sec. But I mean, these are guidelines for vinegar. For nitrate, just of course, make sure that you keep it away from any source of heat. Also keep the temperature below 21 degrees Celsius, even if you don't want it to be kind of completely frozen, and the humidity is the same way. Anyway, so here is a list of the kind of equipment and supplies you would need in order to do film inspection. You know, not many places have the capacity to do film inspection, but if you would like to invest in it, it's usually good to know where to start. So basically, you would need, the first thing is that you would need is a rewinding table to be able to go through the films, to rewind it like as shown here, which is a picture of the inspection bench in our office. So it would be a bench where you could work, clean the film, and also have like a light mechanism here so that you could look up on each frame in detail, so you can see how many scratches a film has or things like that. Another thing in terms of film cleaning, it's always recommended to get some eucalyptus oil or and also alcohol, both together. A few years ago, and some archives still use things like Renew, which are very heavy chemical kind of cleaning solutions. I mean, I personally don't use that at all, and I don't recommend it, not only because Renew is a health hazard, but also because it can be actually, you know, a bit too intense for the film itself. Eucalyptus oil at least helps to hydrate the film a little, and it will help you remove any of the annoying like tape residue or dust and things like that that you might come across. That with some alcohol is usually more than enough to get rid of most of the things you would want to remove from a film to clean it thoroughly. And Weber wipes, which are basically kind of like these, I think, yeah, you can't really see it here, but it's right there in the background. It's kind of like a roll of kind of almost cottony, but not really, cleaning wipes that you would use because it doesn't snag on the film. So those are good. I know some archives also use like pieces of velvet, because it also doesn't snag on the film while they're cleaning it. So there are different things that you can use, but for sure web roll wipes are the most sanitary, and they're disposable. You just toss them afterwards. You definitely need nitrile gloves. I mean, you can use cotton gloves, but again, cotton gloves are usually best for paper archives, not necessarily film, because when you're dealing with film, first off, the cotton kind of holds on to dust a bit more, and then you're probably transferring more dust onto the celluloid while you're cleaning it and not realizing it. But also it can sometimes snag onto a film, especially if a strip of film has a lot of damaged perfs or things like that. Nitrile are just the most sanitary and the easiest to use, honestly, when you're working on a bench. If you have a shrinkage gauge, which is basically a small mechanism, apologies, I don't have a picture of it, but if you can somehow find it, which you probably will if you go through different organizations that are basically donating them all the time. There's the Association for Moving Image Archivists have their own listserv, and lots of people kind of ask, do you have a shrinkage gauge to spare? And people are like, sure, so you can get it that way, or check filmcare.org. Also, you can reach out to institutions like the National Film Preservation Foundation to see where you can get one. They tend to be a little bit pricier, maybe $1,000, and it's a small little device. And basically, you put the film on it, and it helps you to measure how much, how much in terms of percentage the film has shrunken, so that whether it's really far gone, whether you need to digitize it right away, things like that. Some of it you can tell by just looking at it. But sometimes, to get a more specific, kind of very detailed look on how much shrinkage has happened is helpful through the shrinkage gauge, mostly because sometimes there are a lot of films that, we would rent out to be screened on film, but if the shrinkage is more than a certain percentage, we don't allow it. And we say, no, you can only screen this film as a digital copy. That's the main use for us at CFA, for example. You would need a lot of paper tape to help you, not just when you're inventorying film, but even like sometimes when you're doing different kinds of repairs, you would want to stabilize it on the bench while you're working, and taping it down if it's a film that's very shrunken is very helpful. Splicer and splicing tape, of course, to help redo or add new splices to damaged film. And also film leader, which is basically this, I don't know if you can see it here, but like white thing that we add to a film. And this is basically to protect the film, and you will need lots of that as well, depending on how many films you have in your collection. So quick note about photochemical preservation. This is really ultimately what all our work boils down to in terms of film preservation, is that we try as much as possible, once the film has been stabilized and inspected, if we know that it's a historically important film, then we try to create a new duplicate, a new film print through the National Film Preservation Foundation. They offer regular granting cycles to help fund photochemical preservation of film. This is because digitization is mostly done for access, and the life of a digital file is extremely limited. The true preservation of film means creating a new print, ideally with new internegatives, to make sure that you have all of the elements of a film together, and it can survive for another 100 years, for example. And for sure, CFA, like many other film archives, applies for funding from the NFPF every cycle to help preserve key elements in our collections. It's a big part of what we do and a big part of what many film archives do. So mostly, I just want to make a quick distinction between preservation and restoration practices, because this kind of comes up a lot when we're discussing what film preservation is or what it entails. These are two image stills from a collection, an item in our collection called 8 Flags for 99 Cents. It's a film from 1970, and it's from the Chuck Olin collection. This was preserved through support from the NFPF in 2013. So the original film, and this is one of the kinds of deterioration that you will notice while you're inspecting a film, is the amount of color fade that it has. So this film is very color faded. It was very red, magenta type. That means a lot of the color was, disappeared from the frames due to just environmental conditions and stuff. And a lot of films from the 70s especially end up looking like this. But this is an important film that we wanted to preserve. So we knew that, it would be hard to try to get it to look what it was initially shot like, especially because the film actually we didn't have like an extra print that looked great, or we didn't have the original film negatives. Actually didn't have anything at all except one film print, and everything else for this film was lost. So usually color fade is very, very hard to correct, and you can't really bring a film back, but actually we tried to do some measure of I guess you would say restoration through Color Lab, which you can see in this image here. A lot of the color, the natural colors, or the way the film was originally shot is reflected here. So what we requested from Color Lab, which is the main lab in America that can still do this kind of work, we asked for dupe negatives, which is just another set of negatives that they can produce from the original print that we sent them. And we asked for the creation of 2 new archival prints, one which was an answer print, and another distribution print, so that we can also screen it on film when we wanted to. Of course, we also add, like, you have to do different things, like add the NFPF and CFA logos onto the new prints, so that whomever is watching it knows that this was preservation work done through the assistance of the NFPF. And then we also request digitized copies of the new prints, even though we can digitize them on site. If we have the money for someone else to do it so that our capacity isn't sucked up by that work, that's great. So what Color Lab helped us do is something called a digital imaging process. And that was done to help fix some of the extreme color fade that you see here. And also digital imaging is helpful if a film has been, if it has too many splices, or, has other things that can affect its image quality. Basically, the way it works is that the film, for example, this extremely color faded print, is scanned via liquid gate, which is another technical thing that they use to kind of eliminate, scratches. Like you see this big scratch here. It helps soften it, and you can kind of still see it here, but it softens it a lot. And then they color correct the digital iteration of that, and then they take the digital file and then put it back onto film. So it's a very complicated process. It doesn't just end with the digitization. You actually create a new print from that. So, I use this as an example to try to get like the differences between preservation and restoration out of the way, but also note that there's some overlap, a lot, like what happened with this film, in terms of it as being a practice. And because I think there's a lot of there tends to be a lot of confusion still about, is digitization restoration and things like that. So, basically in a film archive, what we're trying to do is preservation, which, as it pertains to any other or a major art form that you're kind of devoting time to, so like a painting or things like that, your preservation basically focuses on the maintenance and repair of existing historic materials and retention of a property's form as it has evolved over time. Preservation in this sense, when it comes to film, means duplication of the original form through the photochemical process. That's the standard. True preservation, entails film stabilizing, rehousing, and then ultimately, if you have the resources to do so, and especially if it's an important film, you try to get a photochemically preserved copy of it. And then any kind of heavy-handed interventions in the image is avoided. So usually we wouldn't even ask Color Lab to help us color correct an image and then create a new print out of that. the only reason it was done was because that this version was extremely faded and there were no other versions that existed, and we knew it was an important film. So we were just trying to bring it back to life a little bit, but not like have like a lot of, other digital kind of artificial artifacts kind of entered onto the frame or anything like that. Restoration basically depicts an object at a particular time in its history, but also removing evidence of other periods. So a lot of times when we're talking about digital restoration in terms of film, they are made with the contemporary audience in mind. So a lot of digital restoration you will see usually removes any and all evidence of scratches or gate hair. There's a lot of work in color correction and so on. I mean, audiences throughout time were actually their eyes were accustomed to seeing a lot of scratches on the frame when they were watching a film in the theater. It never occurred to them that this was a huge fault of the film or anything. Like it didn't matter. But contemporary audiences are very used to a certain kind of look that doesn't have scratches and things like that. So that's all eliminated during the restoration process. And then you have maybe arguably more heavy-handed things added in digital restoration, which a lot of archivists, even if they work in digital restoration, would be against anyway, because you're altering the entire nature and shape and context of the film. I think there was a film recently by, I forget the name of the filmmaker, I think it was Peter Jackson, who did, he took a lot of archival film of World War II and colorized it and created a new film out of that. And that has spurred a lot of debate about restoration and what it means to preserve film. There's a lot of nuances within this argument, again, and the differences between preservation and restoration, but that's basically how we approach it as a film archive and how many other archives kind of approach it. So that was a very quick overview, as quick as possible. Some of it was a little bit basic and some of it kind of was maybe a bit involved, I'm not sure, but in general, I would recommend that you try to check out this handbook at the Film Preservation Handbook at the filmpreservation.org. It's one of the standard texts that everyone uses in terms of how to care for different elements of your collection and stuff like that. Definitely visit our website for more information on the kind of collections that we have. And we also have some film care guides, tips on through there. And if you have any other questions after this session, please email me directly at yasmin@chicagofilmarchives.org. I can also put these links into the chat box, but that's basically it. So I'll stop sharing the screen, and if there's any questions.
That was so great and so informative. Thank you so much. I think the group definitely appreciates that. I do have a few questions that I pulled from the chat. And so we can go through them. And then if there are any else after that, folks can just unmute themselves or drop them in the chat, whichever is the preference. So Tim asks, I'm going to get Tom's name wrong. Palazzolo is a common last name in the area where he's in Springfield. Did the films in your photo come from the family in Springfield?
No. I mean, maybe Tom has family there. I'm not sure, but I could ask him. That's a good question, actually. We should ask him. He's very nice. But no, nice. As far as I know, that it has no relation, actually. But.
Okay. And then Justin has a 3-part question. For films with magnetic strips, would you suggest eucalyptus oil? Will it clean as well as lubricate? And would eucalyptus oil need to be cleaned off before long-term storage?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch. Will it be cleaned off before what?
Long-term storage.
Yeah, I mean, full mag is always tricky because almost anything can scratch it, honestly, while you're working on it. And alcohol is definitely in almost all cases way too damaging for a film with full coat mag. I mean, sometimes we need to use a little bit of it with a cotton swab to get rid of a lot of tape residue. But eucalyptus oil, I would definitely recommend. It's a lot more gentle. It won't scratch the film or cause it to, become any wonkier than it probably already is, because again, 16 millimeter full coat mag is like not great. To be honest, it doesn't stay for too long, but yeah, you could just put it, and then, you know, once you put the film back and rewind it and rehouse it, it's absolutely fine. It dries pretty quickly. There's nothing else you need to do, I don't think.
Great. And then do you use, this is from Roberta. Well, I'm not Roberta. I don't know why I just printed it myself. Pardon me. Do you use the isopropyl alcohol undiluted, and in addition to either web grill pads or velvet, is a microfiber cloth usable?
Microfiber cloth is fine. I just find it a bit more, I don't know, it sometimes snags on the film when I'm working, especially if the film is very damaged or what have you. So it's okay, but I think archivally speaking, web roll is the best. Sometimes people use velvet, but obviously you would need to clean it all the time. So, you know, that's one thing if you don't have access to web roll wipes. Like I've worked in archives in other countries and they didn't have access to that. So we just kept using pieces of velvet. You know, people come up with their own DIY solutions depending on where you are. But here it's pretty easy to just order off of, you know, something evil like Amazon, but you know, it's easy to get in big quantities, and it's affordable. Yeah, I'm sorry, did she ask about whether it was specifically a kind of format or
No,
a film form?
she was just asking, I mean,
With the eucalyptus
tripe
oil?
in. Yeah.
Oh, about the alcohol, usually 70%. 70% is isopropanol is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Diana asks, where will there be on-site volunteer or intern opportunities through CFA with COVID restrictions lifted?
Right now I'm, you know, training a lot of interns to work remotely. So we're doing a lot of cataloging work with different interns. That I anticipate will change, probably not in the fall, but most likely in the spring, when we get a better sense of how, you know, everything has developed with people going back to the office full time and, you know, things like that. So there won't be in the immediate future, but for sure in the spring, there will be on-site opportunities available for internships. And if anyone wants to intern, they basically contact me. So
great. All right. Could you talk about the different in parentheses related film components you might find in an archives, stuff like tracks, A and B roll, trims, etc., and how they relate to each other?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. Obviously, if you're dealing with an archive or a collection that belongs to a filmmaker, or you know, if there's a feature-length film archive or something like that, like what the Academy would have, for example, they wouldn't just get, you know, the film print or the insert print. They would get all of the elements, you know, most likely if they've survived. I mean, if you're really lucky, you would get the camera negative, which is like the original negative that was in the camera itself, and that's great for archival purposes in terms of preservation and creating a beautiful new print of that film. You will get, you know, internegatives. You'll get possibly sound negative if it's an optical soundtrack, or a bunch of full coat mag tracks if it's especially if it's a documentary film. It's usually 16 millimeter full coat mag, or, you know, an experimental kind of film with where the producers had more of a limited capacity. You would have a ton of trims and outtakes. Roll A and roll B for sure. You know, sometimes one of the things that I come across a lot, and this is where the work gets very complicated and very involved, is where you have like little rolls of, you know, image with full coat mag strip, like rolled onto itself, not even on a core, just kind of like, you know, and that's because the lab sent it directly once it was printed, and the editor is supposed to try to make sense of it and put it on the table and like try to match up the image and sync the image with the sound and stuff like that. And there's like always a lot of conversation between the filmmaker and the editor and how they want a film to go. So you would end up getting a lot of the after effects of this work. And those are always, I have to say, you know, I mean, inventorying is easy. Trying to process that and trying to put those together is super difficult, and it's very time consuming for sure. And yeah, you would also get, again, maybe another kind of, I already said internegative, but most likely another answer print, couple of distribution prints. If the film, was in distribution a lot and it was screened a lot, you would probably have different versions of that too. You might have, the first distribution print that they made in 1971, and then they probably made another one in 1980 something, and they would give you all of that. So
Great. Did Tom also do the films on the old Maxwell Street Market? I think the answer is yes to that.
yeah, he did a couple of films about Maxwell Street, and he also collected a lot of films that he found about Maxwell Street for like unknown filmmakers and stuff like that we have on our website. He
Great,
just
and
bought everything.
And follow up, Miguel asked, what was the name of the gloves that you used? Nitrile, so
Nitrile. Those are usually the best and the most comfortable when you're trying to inspect a film.
Great. And then, do you ever put citation information slides in your access copies? Would you put your watermark on access copies that were shared between CFA and another institution? Asks Karen.
Yeah, the first part of the question, yep, we put a slide at the beginning of every access file that basically, says the title, the name of the collection, the director, if we know, a date, even if it's just circa 1934, like we have to put something down, whether or not it's color and the format. We put all of that information in the initial slide, and like you can check on our website, all of the access files look like this. Basically, you put play, you have that initial slide. Because it makes it easy for access purposes. Not everyone is going to read the cataloging notes or anything, so you just want to make sure that that's on there. And yes, any film, to be honest, that we share with other institutions, or any film that basically leaves our premises digitally or whatever, would have our watermark on it, unless the institution or individual in question is requesting a copy for other reasons, like a documentary filmmaker or things like that, but that's different. We wouldn't give them a watermarked copy, for sure.
Great. Does anybody else have any other questions? That's all the ones that I've seen in the chat, but if you do have a question, feel free to either drop it in the chat or unmute yourself. All right. Well, if no one has any questions, thank you so much for this presentation. I found it very informative as someone who has not really had any film initiation, so this was really great. And I was wondering, are you comfortable sharing the slides with the participants? If that's okay, if you want to send them to me, then I can disseminate them if you're comfortable. And then, so Tim asks, was the 8 Flags film made on Kodak film, since that had a lot of color problems in the 1970s?
Yeah, it was made on Kodak. Yeah. And you're right, in the 70s, it did have a lot of problems. So.
Miguel, totally agree. We are recording this, and then we'll work out where it lives so people can view it in the future. Thank you for that, those encouraging words. All right, well, if that's it, then everybody, again, once more, thank you for coming, and have a great rest of your week, and enjoy your weekend. I hear it's going to be very wet.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.